were heavily sort of centers of the Industrial Revolution. Their products could be produced very quickly, reach market quickly, get sold. The money invested in their production comes back to the capitalist and they can put it back into production again. So you have a shorter turnover time, and Marx uses examples of maybe 5 or even 10 turnovers within 1 year. So in other words, he's talking about 5 or 10 week turnover times. So there's a big variation of turnover by sector, but also one can see that within a sector, more efficient individual capital can increase its efficiency by increasing turnover. It can make sure it sells its commodities quickly. It can find other ways of doing just-in-time type manufacturing and so on. And in reducing turnover time, it's a way that capital can increase its profit effectively because it's more efficient in the use of the capital that it's got under its control. The third concept that Marx uses in volume 3 from volume 2 is the concept of the circulation of surplus value. Okay, this is probably the most advanced of the 3 concepts. I mean, it gets, to grasp it, we get slightly more difficult each time, right? So let's see if we can explain the circulation of surplus value. Surplus value is realized on the sale of the commodities. So it's part of the price of the commodity. And then it actually, when the commodity is sold, the surplus value changes form and is in the form of money, which is profit. Now, once the profit is realized, portions of the annual surplus value are realized more quickly than others. In other words, if your turnover time or period is only 5 weeks or 10 weeks, then you're going to sell some commodities, you're going to realize a surplus value, you're going to have a profit, so you're going to have money in your hand. This is, Marx uses the term, the reflux of money capital. Money capital which has come back to the capitalist and which is greater than the money which they put into this cycle, it can either be hoarded or saved up, if you like, in order to later on buy and replenish the machinery or the buildings, or it can be put back into the elements of production and keep the production moving. The faster the turnover is, the less money capital is tied up in producing a given set of commodity values. The circulating capital advance comes back more quickly. This reduces the annual investment required. So capital requires less capital advanced for the same capital applied. Okay, Marx makes this distinction. He's saying basically, if you can keep using the same money every 5 weeks or every 10 weeks, then you don't have to outlay over a whole year a wage bill. You're going to get the equivalent of your wages back every 5 or 10 weeks. So even for the same number of workers, you don't have to have so much money in hand in order to keep those workers employed. So insofar as this capital that circulates is variable capital, the capital required annually is reduced. And it's reduced by the number of turnover periods there are in the year. Okay. Now this seems a very technical point. It's this major point of management of capitalist concerns, which is to be efficient in the working of your capital, to keep it moving and to bring it back and to keep it on the case, if you like. I want to take a slight pause for thought here. So what have we done so far? We've looked at the concepts from volume 1 that move into and affect volume 3. We've looked at some of the concepts of volume 2, which I think affect the argument of volume 3. And I've said that these come from the middle section of volume 2. Now what I want to do is to look at the other 2 aspects, which is what are the concepts from the very beginning of Capital that influence volume 3, and what about the different parts of volume 3 itself? Okay, so this is now the sort of the 3rd and the 4th part of the setup. As regards the first three parts of volume 3A, I call it, okay, this is an overview, right? What Marx is doing here is transforming simple values into what he calls prices of production. These are modified values based on a contradiction, and the contradiction is between cost and value of a capitalist commodity. So in part 1 of volume 3, he posits the rate of profit as the product of both the rate of surplus value and the inverse of the organic composition of capital. I'll explain this more as we go on, okay? My basic argument is that the premise that Marx poses is essentially correct, but in part 2, he doesn't live up to the variables that he's posited in part 1. So part 2, as the text stands, derives the general or the average rate of profit, but it only looks at the variation of the organic composition by sector. In other words, you've got more or less high-tech sectors will affect how they work in the realization of a rate of profit. And Marx, in this solution, holds surplus value as a presumed common rate. And he says explicitly a couple of times he's looking at the surplus value within one country. So what I'm saying is that Marx's solution is a partial solution, even based on the premises which he poses at the beginning of volume 3. And the question of how that then affects part 3 is that the contradiction of profit is seen as essentially arising from the rising organic composition of capital, and leads to his positing of the necessity of crisis. So the crisis is brought on by the rising organic composition of capital, and it's then left to a relatively peripheral status in part 3, this question of the rate of surplus value. Okay, so the final thing I want to do in setup is to explain how the beginning of volume 3 relates to, but is different from, the beginning of volume 1. Okay, now in volume 1, the commodity starts off as a contradiction in unity, okay, or a contradictory unity, right? So it's both a use value and an exchange value. And from this initial positing, Marx develops a fuller explanation where exchange value is the form of value and socially necessary labor time is the substance of value. And he can't do this looking at the commodity as an individual item. He can only do this by positing the commodity as part of a community of commodity producers. So when we say socially necessary labor time, it is socially necessary labor time. There's a social, unmissable, inevitable social element to the definition of what is necessary labor. Now, at this stage in his argument, these are commodity producers, then implicitly, at best, capitalists, but the class relation is only implicit at the beginning of volume 1. And this is the diagram I use to show what I think is the movement in volume 1. So you can have use value and exchange value. Then we look at concrete and abstract labor and socially necessary labor time, and then exchange value and money. So you have this movement from initial positing to internal relation and its essential nature to a modified understanding of what the appearance of the commodity is. Okay, that's the cycle. Marx goes back to this, actually, at the beginning of volume 3. He once again goes back to the commodity as a contradictory unity. But now the commodity is explicitly something which is produced by capital. And it's produced by individual capitals in a system of competing capitals. So the capitalist relation is now fully stamped on the commodity. And the contradiction which Marx investigates or posits to be investigated at the beginning of volume 3 is a different one. It's not use value and exchange value, it's something else. And that contradiction is that the commodity is one at the same time the product of exploited labor